I've noticed something over the years that has stayed with me more than many balance sheets ever did. A great many people are not poor because they spend too much. They are poor because they save in the wrong places. That is a very different mistake. The world teaches people a childish definition of financial discipline. It tells them that wisdom is mostly about reduction, cheaper groceries, cheaper clothes, cheaper meals, cheaper tools, cheaper help, cheaper decisions everywhere. And if a person does this often enough, he begins to feel responsible. He begins to feel serious. He begins to feel that he understands money because he has become highly skilled at saying no to small expenses. Then, often without noticing it, he makes one decision that cost him $10,000 because he was trying to save $300. That is a bad trade. I have seen people drive across town to save a few dollars on household items and then spend years delaying a decision that would have multiplied their earning power because they did not want to pay for a course, a teacher, a specialist, or the right equipment. That is like stepping over a $100 bill to pick up a dime. It is economically creative, if you want to be polite about it. The problem is not thrift. I admire thrift. I was raised in a world where waste had a smell to it and where every dollar had a job. The problem is confusion. People confuse being cheap with being wise. Those are not the same talent. A cheap person focuses on the amount leaving his hand. A wise person focuses on what the dollar is buying over time. That difference changes everything. If a dollar leaves my hand and buys speed, skill, safety, health, trust, or long-term compounding, that dollar did not disappear. It went to work. If a dollar stays in my hand but costs me years of delay, worse decisions, weaker output, higher risk, or missed compounding, then I did not save it. I spent it very badly. That is how I want you to think. Money is not just for preserving itself. If the goal were merely to avoid spending, the smartest move would be to lock every dollar in a vault and never touch it again. You would die with a very protected vault and a very underbuilt life. That is not intelligence. Money is a tool, and a tool should be judged by what it builds. Does it build skill? Does it build options? Does it build health? Does it build time? Does it build safety? Does it build room? Does it build a future in which your choices belong more to you and less to fear? That is the standard. Over the years, I have come to distrust people who talk about saving money without talking about the purpose of the saving. Saving for what? To buy more freedom, to buy more skill, to buy more durability, to buy more time. Those answers make sense to me. Saving so that you can feel virtuous while quietly making low. Great decisions everywhere else does not impress me much. That is false prudence. It is the sort of prudence that keeps a person emotionally comfortable and financially small. The older I get, the more I believe there are a handful of places where trying to be too frugal is not wise at all. It is expensive, not immediately expensive, perhaps. Sometimes it flatters you for a while. Sometimes it lets you feel clever in the short term, but later it sends a bill. The bill might arrive as wasted time. It might arrive as weak health. It might arrive as poor output. It might arrive as a preventable legal or tax mistake. It might arrive as a life memory you cannot buy back once it has passed. Or it might arrive as a retirement account that had 10 or 15 fewer years than it needed. The bill always arrives. That is why I no longer ask only what something costs. I ask what it costs not to do it properly. That is one of the most valuable questions in finance. What does it cost not to do it properly? Once you begin asking that, a lot of cheap decisions stop looking economical. The first thing I stopped trying to be cheap about was knowledge. This surprises people because the modern world has made free information feel like an identity. Everyone is very proud of learning things for free. Now, free videos, free newsletters, free threads, free podcasts, free opinions from a man whose cousin once bought a stock and did not immediately lose money. Wonderful. If your goal is to spend as much time as possible wandering through partial answers, then the system is working beautifully. Now, I am not ungrateful for free information. I have read a tremendous amount in my life that cost almost nothing. I built much of my early education in rooms where the entry fee was low and the shelves were rich. So this is not an argument that value appears only behind a paywall. It is an argument about the real price of scattered knowledge. The price is often time, and time is more expensive than money. That is one of the few facts in life that grows more obvious every year you remain alive. A person will hesitate to spend $500 on a great teacher, a serious course, a specialized program, or direct guidance from someone who actually knows what he is doing. He will say that is expensive. Then he will spend the next 2 years drifting through low-grade substitutes, half learning the subject, repeating mistakes, and moving in circles, because all of his education was gathered in fragments. He does not see the cost because the cost did not arrive as one invoice. It arrived as delay. Delay is one of the costliest expenses in the world because it rarely feels like spending while it is happening. It feels like caution. It feels like thrift. It feels like responsible hesitation. Then one day the person realizes he could have bought back an enormous amount of time by paying for clarity earlier. That realization hurts. Imagine someone trying to learn a language. He can spend years bouncing between random applications, unfinished lessons, and disconnected advice from strangers. Or he can find an excellent teacher and compress a wandering journey into a direct one. The same principle applies to investing, writing, negotiation, coding, accounting, communication, sales, operating a business, or almost any other skill that changes what the market is willing to pay you. People see the price tag on instruction and often miss the real arithmetic. If I pay $500 to learn a skill that later increases my annual earning power by $10,000, then that $500 was not a cost in the ordinary sense. It was one of the best bargains available to me. The reason I say this so bluntly is that people will often spend thousands upgrading a car to look a little more successful and then become suddenly heroic in their frugality when the subject turns to upgrading the mind that produces every future dollar. That is upside down. Your most productive asset is not your car. It is not your watch. It is not the paint color of your house. It is the collection of knowledge, judgment, pattern recognition, and usefulness sitting between your ears. If you improve that machine, it changes what the world will pay you. That is worth respecting. I have always believed that a person who compounds in both capital and capability is extraordinarily dangerous in the best possible way. Capital compounds through ownership. Capability compounds through learning. The second often accelerates the first. This is why I never admired the habit of proudly learning things the slow way when the faster way was available at a sensible price. There is a kind of ego in that. People tell themselves they are being resourceful. Often they are simply being expensive with their own time. The second thing I stopped trying to be cheap about was milestone memories. This is a harder subject because it exposes one of the strangest diseases in adulthood. People begin to treat money as though the final score of life were the number left over when they die. They start talking as if the whole purpose of discipline is to arrive at the end with the largest visible pile. That is not a sane philosophy. Money was never meant to be the point. It is a tool for building a life. And a life is not built only from efficient grocery purchases and optimized recurring bills. A life is also built from gatherings, thresholds, moments, and human experiences that do not repeat on command. Nobody sits around 20 years later glowing with emotion because he chose the cheaper detergent on an ordinary Tuesday. That story rarely survives the week, much less the decade. But people do remember the wedding where everyone they loved was in one room. They remember the graduation that represented years of effort finally becoming visible. They remember the reunion where 3 generations laughed at stories that should not have been told in public. They remember the birthday that brought an old friend back into their arms. They remember the trip that marked the closing of one season and the beginning of another. These are not daily purchases. That is exactly the point. They are milestones. And milestones have a brutal investment policy. They often happen once. Money can be earned again. The market can recover. Opportunities can return in other forms. But a certain age, a certain room, a certain family configuration, a certain wedding, a certain parent still alive, a certain child at a certain stage, a certain celebration at a certain moment in your life. Those do not keep rescheduling themselves because your spreadsheet wanted another year of perfect efficiency. This does not mean recklessness. I have no respect for emotional overspending disguised as memory making, but I have also seen people squeeze so hard that they removed the meaning from the very life their money was supposed to support. That is not wisdom. That is accounting without perspective. If you spend well on a milestone memory, I do not see that as indulgence. I see it as proper use of capital in service of something time, sensitive and deeply human. The question is not did the money leave? Of course it left. The better question is what remained after it left. Did it create debt and regret? Or did it create something so durable in memory and relationship that no future market return could truly replace it? A rational person should know the difference. The third thing I stopped trying to be cheap about was health. Health is one of those subjects people like to postpone because it is not dramatic until it is. Let me put it simply. If someone gave you a car and told you that it was the only car you would ever own for the rest of your life, you would behave very differently toward it. You would notice the noises. You would change the oil. You would not skip maintenance to save a small amount. You would not feed it garbage and then act surprised when it failed. You would understand that you were not managing an accessory. You were managing a non-replaceable system. Well, the body works under a very similar contract. You get one. That does not stop people from trying to save money in absurd ways. They buy food that weakens them because it is cheaper by the package. They treat sleep as an optional hobby. They move only when guilt becomes loud enough to overcome inertia. They postpone checkups, ignore symptoms, neglect recovery, and then call the consequences bad luck. That is not bad luck. That is bad arithmetic. There are 3 things that quietly support almost every productive year of your life: sleep, nutrition, movement. People want something more glamorous than that. They want the trick. There is no trick. If one side of that triangle collapses, the rest of life begins wobbling. Good sleep sharpens judgment. Better nutrition fuels output. Consistent movement protects energy, mood, resilience, and the physical foundation of work itself. These are not decorative upgrades. They influence the machine that creates every future dollar you will ever earn. That is why I no longer see spending on health as ordinary spending. A good mattress can be an investment. Better food can be an investment. Regular medical care can be an investment. A gym membership you actually use can be an investment. Walking shoes can be an investment. Physical therapy at the right time can be an investment. None of these things guarantee perfection. They improve the machine, and improving the machine is one of the highest return uses of capital. People often laugh at paying more for quality food and then think nothing of paying far more later for the consequences of years of neglect. That is a terrible trade. Cheap food can be very expensive. Cheap sleep habits can be very expensive. Cheap treatment of the body can be very expensive. And when the bill comes, it is often collected not only in money but in reduced energy. Shorter attention, worse patience, poorer decisions, and weaker output. That is too high a price. The fourth thing I stopped trying to be cheap about was the tools used for serious work. Now, when you are beginning being scrappy is fine. In fact, it can be helpful. A simple setup can teach you fundamentals. It keeps you focused on skill rather than gear. You do not need the fanciest camera in the world to learn how to tell a story. You do not need the perfect office to begin writing. You do not need a state of the art studio to record the first useful piece of work. That is not where the danger lies. The danger comes later, when the tools that once helped you start begin quietly limiting how far you can go, and you keep calling the limitation thrift. I have seen this in nearly every field. The computer is too slow. The software crashes. The microphone makes a good idea sound amateur. The camera misses detail that now matters. The workflow takes twice as long as it should, because the tools keep fighting the person trying to use them. At that point, the cheap decision is no longer cheap. It is expensive in hours, and hours are what life is made of. If a better machine saves you 1 hour a day, what is that worth over a year? Even at a modest value for your time, and for serious work, your time is often worth far more than you think, because time saved is not only time recovered, it is energy preserved, output increased, attention protected. I often think people understand productive assets too narrowly. They imagine a productive asset must be a stock, a bond, a rental unit, or a business. Sometimes the most productive asset you can buy is a better tool that allows you to do the same work twice as well and twice as fast. A serious writer with a proper setup, a creator with reliable recording equipment, a contractor with better instruments, an editor with faster hardware, an operator with software that removes friction. These things change economics. A good tool does not replace skill. It allows skill to travel farther. That is worth paying for. The fifth thing I stopped trying to be cheap about was safety and security. This is not an exciting subject, which is one reason people neglect it. Nobody wakes up thrilled to buy insurance. Nobody gathers friends around the dinner table to boast about a safe, a security system, legal protection, or proper documentation. Fine. Excitement is not the test. Consequence is the test. One of the first rules in investing is protect the downside. You can spend years doing the right things, saving, building, investing, working, learning. Then one large unprotected event can erase a shocking amount of progress. That is how asymmetry works in the wrong direction. A few $100s saved each year by skipping insurance can feel like a tiny triumph until the year it costs you tens of thousands. The same applies to securing important assets, documents, jewelry, equipment, records, passwords, titles, or anything whose loss would create chaos larger than its annual protection cost. People call this paranoia when they have not yet experienced loss. Then loss arrives and suddenly basic risk management looks wise. I prefer to look wise before the event. A good safe, a proper lock system, a secure digital process, insurance that is actually appropriate, document storage that protects what matters. These things are not glamorous, they are rational. The goal is not to create a life free from all risk. That is impossible. The goal is to reduce the chance that one bad day undoes 10 good years. That is a very sensible goal. The sixth thing I stopped trying to be cheap about was hiring professionals when the stakes were meaningful. This is difficult for many people because doing things yourself has moral appeal. It feels independent, it feels scrappy, it feels admirable, and in many areas of life, learning to do things yourself is valuable. I have nothing against competence. I do have something against fake competence. There is a concept, Charlie, and I respect it deeply. Stay within your circle of competence. Know what you know what you do not know. Most expensive mistakes begin, not when people know nothing, but when they know a little and feel certain anyway. That is dangerous. It becomes especially dangerous in law, taxes, estate planning, contracts, business structuring, and significant financial decisions. These are areas where small details matter enormously. One clause in a document, one election you did not know was available, one tax treatment you misunderstood, one filing error, one wrong assumption about basis, trust structure, liability, or timing. These details can cost real money, often much more money than the professional fee required to avoid the mistake in the first place. I have seen people pay a few $100s for a good tax conversation and save tens of thousands because the person on the other side understood the system better than they did. That is not an expense in any ordinary sense. That is excellent capital allocation. I have also seen the opposite. People avoided paying for good advice, wandered far outside their competence, and then paid a vastly larger amount to repair something that should never have broken. Mistakes are usually more expensive than advice. That is a principle worth remembering. No, you do not need to hire professionals for every minor question. But when the issue matters, when the amount is meaningful, when the downside is large, and when you are clearly outside your depth, paying for real expertise is one of the smartest financial decisions you can make. The proud amateur is often a very expensive character. The final thing I stopped trying to be cheap about was retirement investing, and here the mathematics become almost cruel. When it comes to long-term investing, time is not just helpful. Time is the machine. People say they understand compound interest. Usually they understand it only as an idea. They do not yet respect it as a timeline. The beginning of compounding is emotionally unimpressive. That is why so many people postpone it. They tell themselves they will start later. Later, unfortunately, is where the arithmetic becomes merciless. Imagine two people with similar lives and similar ambitions. One begins early, not perfectly, not heroically, just early enough. The other waits 10 or 15 years because there were always more urgent pleasures, more attractive upgrades, more persuasive excuses, a nicer apartment, a bigger car, a few more years of living as though the future were infinitely patient. Eventually the second person starts, but by then he is not really racing the market. He is racing the clock. That is a race few people win gracefully. Each dollar invested early is not just $1. It is $1 plus years of multiplication. And those years matter far more than people realize. In the early phase, the account looks disappointingly small. That is when most people say, "See, this can wait." They misunderstand the whole thing. The reason the account looks small is not that it is unimportant. It is that compounding is still underground. The roots are growing where the eye cannot yet admire them. That is why time in the market beats trying to time the market for ordinary people again and again. You do not need to predict every rise and fall. You need to begin. You need to keep going. And you need to give the machine enough years to stop feeling hypothetical and start becoming visible. That is why treating retirement investing as something to be figured out later is one of the most expensive forms of procrastination ever invented. The bill arrives quietly. Then massively, when you step back and look at all of this, a pattern emerges. Money is not most useful when it is defended from every possible outflow. Money is most useful when it is directed intelligently toward things that buy back future time, future strength, future safety, future skill, and future compounding. That is the real game, knowledge that saves years, memories that will not come back, health that protects the machine, tools that raise output, safe professional advice that prevents expensive ignorance, investing that gives compounding enough years to become visible. These are not places where being cheap makes you rich. In many cases, being cheap here makes you quietly poorer than you needed to be. I do not mean poorer only in the account, poorer in energy, poorer in options, poorer in wisdom, poorer in relationships, poorer in future time. That is why I no longer admire a person just because he can reduce a bill. I want to know if he can recognize value, that is the rarer talent. A man who can save $5 is common. A man who can see when spending $500 creates $50,000 of future value is much more dangerous. That is the person who usually wins in the long run because he is not counting only dollars. He is counting direction. He is counting opportunity cost. He is counting what the dollar becomes after it leaves his hand. And that is the whole discipline. The goal is not to spend less money. The goal is to spend money in ways that leave you with more life, more room, more power, more capability, and more compounding. After the spending has occurred, that is wise spending. Everything else is just noise wearing a price tag.